Hello and welcome back again to my channel. So you may have noticed that in the prior few videos I was trying to present my reading of a few papers that were presented in the Idea of Communism conference, which was later compiled into a text and published into a book by Verso in 2010. Now, something that you should know regarding the um, theoretical background which informs many of the papers written is a certain reading of Badiou and a reappraisal of what metaphysics may be. Principally, if for instance one were to consider the advent of a critique of metaphysics, or rather a rejection of that which is metaphysical in philosophy, beginning post Kant, and that is traditionally how many departments in the Anglophone and in other languages divide the history of the discipline, then we would probably mark with Deleuze and Badiou two French philosophers who in some ways brushed this history against the grain. And in this sense, they would be metaphysicians in the sense that they do not interpret the Kantian break as a rejection of the possibility of raising metaphysical questions per se, in the sense that they would still perhaps consider the possibility of constructing an ontology, which is perhaps the conditions between which things of different natures can, well, not coexist merely, but also seek to augment and maybe in some ways recondition themselves. And there's a way in which this brings us to Badiou's edifice for philosophy. And I think there's something that I tried to bring out in one of my earlier presentations regarding what an independent condition for a discipline may be. So what may this mean? Well, an odd example would be to consider what a autonomous agent in an organization may be for an organization. This would be the simplistic way of broaching the issue. And yet there is a way in which a discipline by itself, or any practice or procedure, often takes up very many people, and in this sense is not reducible merely to a member of an organization. So if one were to consider the fact that Badiou states that the conditions for philosophy, the disciplines which allow philosophy to be able to reflect upon breaks in disciplinary logic themselves are independent of the discipline, what would this mean? This would mean that there may be procedures immanent to the practice of art which are in no way reducible to practices that are active in the field of politics, or rather there may be scientific inquiries which simply cannot be deducible or thought through the aspect of love or commitments or romance. And yet this field, or rather these not pillars but perhaps disciplines, perhaps procedures, perhaps aspects of human experience, form what would be a domain, or rather independent bodies of inquiry which inform any practice of what the discipline of philosophy is. Now, this is not a very easy concept to put across, but this is an attempt to try and envision it in some way. I had once tried to consider the possibility that while these domains themselves are autonomous of each other, and this being a certain kind of framework within which Badiou's philosophy as an ontology operates, is it possible to think the relation of these domains to each other? And with this question in mind, I had penned the following essay, which I would like to present to you. The conditions of Badiouian philosophy. Alain Badiou, the preeminent philosopher of our time, in his effort to reinstate a philosophy that dares speak in its name, has laid out 4 conditions on which the edifice of the philosophical project rests on. These 4 pillars, to use an architectural metaphor, correspond to practices integral to our human condition. 1. Politics. 2. Love. 3. Art. 4. Science. The relation of philosophy to these disciplines is not that of a moderator, a position which, rightly speaking, can only operate from within these disciplines themselves. Its position, as I see it, is rather twofold. Philosophy must be able to account for what has been spoken of in Althusserian terms as an epistemological break, a point where from within these disciplines a nameable form of reasoning can no longer continue or is forced to change. An example may be the point where the novel, in its classical form as a Bildungsroman, is forced to confront the space and contours of modernity, along with the multiplicity of encounters it brings. The narrative which unfolds cannot speak straight-facedly in its earlier pastoral register, and comes to terms with the city in a way that literature has not witnessed before. Yet, breaks in the logic of a discipline itself do not account for the task of philosophy. It is here that we must heed Alain Badiou's project to take up ontology itself in its original vocation and begin to think about how such breaks in distinct disciplines can be thought of together, and whether such an inquiry reveals certain fundamental relations which emerge between practices that were not evident earlier, a new situation, and yes, perhaps even a new constellation. At its breaking point, the name for such an event is revolution. Badiou remarks somewhere in a playful dig at Nietzsche that if every work of philosophy is nothing more than an autobiography of the philosopher, then it must also be conceded that an autobiography of a philosopher is a work of philosophy. This is not a trivial matter, for the question of individual authenticity of representation is what seals the sanctity of any autobiography. The reason why such a form is of interest to departments of literature, for example, yet I do not believe I would have much to offer in terms of my own account of the situation of my life, or at least this would not be an offering I deem worthy of what Plato once named the dear delight. My time, which may be represented in a diary entry or blog in this digital age, is itself subject to conditions. conditions not only of my experience, but the place of my experience, this being the strict definition of a situation beyond which I would only be able to posit speculations, a task which I may leave for others. What I would like to take up is the relation between the conditions of philosophy as re-established by Alain Badiou, yet seen from the situation where I find myself. Love, for instance, is bound by the social and, ultimately, the political realities within which a couple may come together. The difference between two personalities, two families, two orders, even revealing themselves in light of the other. This is a sight that is as ancient and as contemporary as wood, water, and poetry. There is always in love a call for an act of boldness, a decision, as it were, to make a pass, a declaration, a token, signifying nothing more than an invocation of the beloved as seen in a moment that seals the destiny of a desire. Where does such a moment take place? Of course, in the encounter. And an encounter, for it to be discernible even, is always an encounter between differences. Let us take up linguistic differences, for these are as commonplace as ever. And despite the various refutations of the linguistic turn, its hermeneutic, like some bad infinity, still appears to linger, whisper from the corridors, as it were, reminding a perplexed philosopher of another order, another kind of relation, which perhaps may not have been represented, such being the criticism which any bold, dare I say great, representation has to face up to. The play of such a turn, as I see it today, itself rests on the invisibilization of an even older dichotomy, not between different languages, but between language and that which is simply not linguistic. An act, a call, a cry, noise, the murmurings of dwellings, of construction laborers hammering outside. As flaccid as such a distinction may be, it is important to notice it. For those who insist on the primacy of linguistic differences don't seem to want to. Yet, does this very distinction, in its very formulation, not house the essential question of intelligibility itself? A border, as it were, where philosophy constantly grapples with that which it does not know or understand. The diminishing of the sophistic role that linguistic differences played for philosophy is nowhere more apparent than on the image-sharing sites such as Instagram. Here, communication is contrived between comments placed beneath images, fronts as it were for entry into DMs or direct messages, which may be sent to inboxes. Is this situation really very different, however, from picket fences and mailboxes that any neighborhood would have had in some form? I state this not to diminish the difference, but to highlight a similarity of function. And it is important to take up the difference, which I believe is a positive and even constructive one. Frederick Jameson, in his diagnosis of contemporary politics, in one of his last public talks on the subject, had a very simple proposition to posit, that today all politics is the politics of real estate. There is, clearly, a very strong truth to this. Yet it is also here that we find a possibility to rework not so much the site of politics, which may always be reduced to contestations over a place, but its strategies and modes of initiation. Here, it is perhaps closest, admittedly in a degraded form, to what we once called love. You may ask why I would want to tarnish a word once deemed sacred, in the West at least. Perhaps because this is the only place and the only way it can be saved from a short-circuited fusion with politics, which has always, in its classical masculine form, posited it as a minor becoming. There is a way in which encounters produce new forms, new platforms even. This is a fact attested to by frontiersmen and stags on online dating apps, in very different narratives, of course. A letter to a mailbox, however, yet remains what attests to the essential step between the public sphere and an invitation to privacy, however necessary or unnecessary. The beginning of what was once recognized as a courtship. And is it surprising that such invocations, as new as they may be, happen in the realm of what is now known as communicational technologies, or to be up to date with the jargon, IT? Badiou, in a moment of Platonic love, declares in his first manifesto for philosophy that science can never be reduced to the technologies it serves, lest it becomes its slave. This is a point I will hold with him, in classical liberal fashion even, withholding the right of formal mathematics to continue to distill the difference between different sizes of infinities, even if they can't be counted. Yet, I believe it was Marx who posited that the technological infrastructure of society does determine the social relations which emerge, and perhaps in our idealism, we should not lose sight of this teaching. In this place, as it were, if I may speak of it as a place, the realm of the symbolic, drawing from Badiou's old teacher, Lacan, where do we see art? Or perhaps even more pertinent, what is art? Is the construction of a narrative, for instance, to be reduced to a report filed in a newspaper or to a boss arranging for the shipment of an order? Is it to remain in erotic seductions, in encounters that have been happening since the dawn of time, but today have found a new vehicle in screens? Is music, that profound violence done to language, to be the only way in which the sense of a place, an idea of belonging, a notion of kinship can be expressed? It is here that I believe that it is up to the artist to say no and demonstrate why. For my own account, let me say this. I agree with Badiou that there was an age of poets, where these remarkable individuals, such as Hölderlin and Malan, sought to supplement what philosophy, following the Industrial Revolution, was yet to come to terms with, i.e., depicting a social imaginary, a shared hermeneutic horizon, the compossibility of differences. In other words, and I do not mean this as a provocation, or rather I do mean this as a provocation, ontology itself by other means. I also agree that perhaps this age of poets is over. Yet this negation of poetry is what fuels, or rather, invocations in literary forms. however painful and frustrating it may be for an artist, particularly one committed to canonical or stylistic purity. The question hence emerges: what can replace the immediacy of experience that the prose poem from France and Germany in the 19th and 20th centuries provided? My own tentative proposition, and I believe the roots of this may have been found in the very movement of poetry shaking off the shackles of rhyme and meter to embrace narrative and analysis, is the essay. Now, I tried to in some ways encapsulate how I see the relations between the four conditions of philosophy, as it were. Conditions which are in themselves metaphysical inasmuch as they are formed independently, autonomously of each other in every such instantiation, and yet they are common inasmuch as they constitute a distinctly human experience and a human practice which, in its engagement with a person, a place, a logic, a narrative, performs a certain kind of intervention. And this may be one way in which the Althusserian notion of an encounter at some very larval level can be framed. However, it is also important that we consider distinct moments, metaphysically even, where such domains, such practices are forced to confront each other. And as I try and point out, these moments would necessarily be social. Having done this, what can we understand in terms of the kinds of forms of communication that are practicable, that are communicable, that are transmittable, that are common within the framework which we are presently inhabiting or working with? And of course, here I try and draw from platforms such as Instagram and try and demonstrate how, in terms of the procedures in play that allow for people to reach out to each other, while distinct in its interface, do resemble certain earlier classical architectural mechanisms such as mailboxes and post offices that an earlier generation, just like ours, relied upon. In fact, I think there's even some arguments for things like pensions and payments to now be directly synced to emails instead of the postal service. And that would constitute in many ways an advancement that would use productively some of the new telecommunicational technologies now presently available. And yet we would require to not merely do this in some kind of episodic snapshot like a postcard, but to be able to come up with a form that can consistently meet such requirements. And of course, it needs to be inviting enough for, let's say, in principle, anyone, which is what the discourse of philosophy claims to present itself to, want to take it up. And here, Badiou, of course, does mark what poetry once tried to do for a certain outlook of the world, and what we may once again have to try and do in remaking a literary form to be able to present human experience in a way that's tangible enough for someone who is distinctly other from us to be able to cognize and find ways in which a picture of their form of inhabitation, their form of life as it were, can be expressed. I do think that this is a slightly dense essay. I shall, of course, as always, leave the text itself in the description, and I would advise that you do read it. I do also, however, provide the video, which I hope we can at some point convert into a podcast so that you can listen to it without looking at the screen, on YouTube, so that in case you are following the series that I have been presenting, you may continue to do so, and perhaps this may clarify some of the references that the other scholars in the conference in question have been drawing from. And that is all for today evening. Thank you for your time. Have a pleasant night. Bye-bye.